Given the demagoguery emanating from our current government and the explicit exploitation of racism and xenophobia to persuade poor and working class white populations that their interests call for an attack on racialized communities, it is important to point out that the suffering of poor, white, and working class communities has been caused pretty much by the same economic phenomena that are responsible for the rise of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, and for the reasons that lead people from Central America, Mexico, elsewhere in the global South to migrate to other countries. The United States can claim 25% of all incarcerated people on the planet, as compared to its 5% of the world's population. With respect to women, there are more women in prison in the US today than there were people of all genders in prison during the 1970s. Between 1980 and 2014, the number of incarcerated women increased by more than 700%, rising from a total of 26,000, a little more than 26,000 in 1980 to more than 215,000 in 2014. I want to look for a moment at the conditions that led to these increases in the imprisoned population in the US and in other countries, that led also to increased immigration, and that led to the further impoverishment of poor and working class communities of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So let's begin with the period of the 1980s, which marks what we know now as the last stage, the last instantiation of capitalism, a mode of production that has indeed become global. Capital has always had global aspirations, and I should point out that capitalism is very much linked to the global conditions produced by slavery. As political scientist Cedric Robinson has insisted, capitalism should be referred to as racial capitalism. But of course, during this period, manufacturing begins to take place across national borders. And incidentally, we might note that this stage of capitalism has begun to further reveal the obsolescence of the nation state as the most appropriate form of human community. We have witnessed over the last decades capital flowing across national borders, information, commodities, knowledge, everything moves easily across the borders of the nation. But of course, when human beings join that flow, when human beings begin to move largely as a result of the consequences of the flow of capital, they are deemed illegal. And of course, all of this began to take place at a time when the welfare state was under assault, at a time of the ascendancy of international finance capital and its demands for structural adjustment, that is to say, demands to move capital away from sectors of the economy that serve the needs of the people. And we're referring to housing and healthcare and education, etc., away from sectors that serve the needs of the people and toward more profitable sectors of the economy. The point is, these are dangerous shifts away from investment in processes that reflect people's needs and toward the production of profit. And of course, this happened all over the world. Countries in the global south were especially affected by this. This was one of the impetuses, along with war, that have driven people to leave their homelands in search of a better life. But in the global north, of course, we witnessed the loss of jobs, deindustrialization, the production of surplus populations, especially among those who have always been vulnerable to job loss and the lack of resources. This is how racism works. Thus, the spread of the prison industry, the emergence of the prison industrial complex, and the repressive means of managing populations that can no longer find a place in the world. As corporations migrated to other parts of the world in search of cheaper labor sources, they disrupted local economies. And this was in part, this served in part as an impetus for migration away from the homeland to places that appeared to represent hope. The point that I'm trying to make is that white economic suffering in the US is directly linked to Black and Latino poverty and to the tendency to lock up people who have been defined as superfluous or irrelevant. Many years ago, a number of us began to organize against what we decided to refer to as the prison industrial complex. We did not know that our analysis would become even more important during the second decade of the 21st century with the election of a billionaire capitalist to office who presumes to want to reverse the very processes that allowed him to make his billions. We now recognize that the election of Trump could have been avoided. And I don't have time to develop a critique of the Democratic Party. But I will say that many of the same issues we are confronting today we would be confronting even if a Democratic candidate had been elected, even if that candidate became the first white woman elected to the presidency in the US. This devastation could have been avoided had radical organizers devoted attention to those white communities that have seen their jobs and their lives slip away as a result of the rise of global capitalism. As a result of the assault on the labor movement, and as a result of the continuing massive transfer of wealth to the already wealthy. We know that 8 billionaires own as much as the poorest half of humanity. Today, it has been calculated that there are approximately 7.6 billion people in the world, half of which would amount to 3.8 billion. Now, 8 people, including Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and we could continue, Warren Buffett, Michael Bloomberg, and others, they own more than 3.8 billion people combined. Isn't that obscene? Why then can people be led so easily to believe that they are poor because immigrants cross the border from Mexico? The figure of the immigrant is an ideologically constructed scapegoat designed to deter poor and working class people in the U.S. from recognizing how much they have in common with people who are fleeing difficult economic circumstances, often created by the very corporations that have left people in the U.S. bereft of employment.